Welcome back everyone from around the world. I'm Emily Pankhurst, joined by Thomas Jefferson, and you are watching the World Revolution News. Today is July the 22nd, 2011.
Today we will focus on the famine in the Horn of Africa. This slow ongoing disaster that dates back to last year is devastating an entire region of the already embattled continent. The famine has been underreported by the mainstream media. The U.S. and its situation in Somalia, as we found out, was more complicated than we imagined. Whether you agree with how the humanitarian aid is distributed, or even interrupted, is a matter of opinion. But the next segment should shine the spotlight on how the United States' connections to an already twisted situation can have some devastating consequences. Whether they are intended or unintended is up for debate. Warning: some of the pictures may be sensitive to some viewers.
Yesterday, the United Nations officially declared that famine exists in Somalia, and that the lives of nearly half of the Somali population, which is over 3.5 million people, are now in crisis. Somalia is facing its worst food security crisis in the last 20 years, says Mark Bowden, the UN official in charge of humanitarian aid in Somalia. He went on to add, "This desperate situation requires urgent action to save lives." UNICEF, which is the United Nations Children's Fund, says that there are 2 million children in Somalia right now, and almost half of these children are already on the critical list. UNICEF has decided to label the situation a children's famine. Somalia has a very complicated and unique position, due to the country having lacked an effective government, even before the famine of the early 1990s. The recent history of Somalia starts in 2007, when Somali President Abdullah Yusuf Ahmed set foot in the capital city of Mogadishu, for the first time since taking office in 2004. His arrival symbolized a victory by Somalia's transitional federal government, or the TFG, which is backed by the US, over a group of fundamentalist Islamic militias, known as the Al-Shabaab, who at that point had grown so powerful over the preceding year that they briefly controlled much of the country's territory. Though international observers had hoped the TFG would bring stability to the war-torn nation after 16 years of a failed state, by mid-2008 experts said the TFG was fraught by internal divisions. Meanwhile, the Al-Shabaab have made a strong comeback, with an increasingly radicalized extremist movement. Most of southern Somalia is controlled by the Al-Shabaab. The Americans claim the Al-Shabaab Islamist fighters have made the drought crisis worse by preventing international aid agencies from distributing food relief. Last year, in some rather shocking allegations reported by the New York Times, the United Nations officials charged the US with imposing conditions that made it impossible to deliver tens of millions in food aid to hungry Somalis. The Americans refused to allow food to be transferred from warehouses in Kenya, claiming it might enrich the coffers of the Al-Shabaab. The US did let some food pass through, but only on the condition that aid workers did not pay any fees at Shabaab checkpoints around the country. But aid workers on the ground were very hesitant, and said that following US orders would make them look like spies. At that point, the relationship between the Al-Shabaab and international aid agencies fell apart, and the United States had accomplished its mission in thinking that a food war would prevail. The US-backed Somalia transitional government waited until this week to declare a drought emergency in Somalia despite UN warnings in January. General Yusuf Siad, a Somali military officer, just yesterday admitted that there is countless corruption in the transitional federal government of Somalia. The general also admitted a lot of Somali government soldiers defected with their weapons and military vehicle and joined the Al-Shabaab militants. There were some government officials who have been involved in cases of selling the government weapons to rebellion groups, Yusuf Siad went on to say. The Obama administration, which now gives the Ethiopian dictatorship more money than any regime in Africa, is, according to Thomas C. Mountain, is either allowing Ethiopia to block the International Red Cross and other aid agencies from carrying out relief work in the region, or doesn't know it. Now the impending and worst famine in decades is happening, with all of these variations in play. This, as well as soaring food prices and long-term issues such as overall underdevelopment and high population growth has led to over 11 million people requiring humanitarian assistance across the Horn of Africa. Oxfam, which is an international confederation of 15 organizations working in 98 countries worldwide to find lasting solutions to poverty and injustice, is assisting new arrivals in Kenya, and says that of the $1 billion is needed to avert a humanitarian disaster, and only $200 million had been pledged. They also went on to accuse several European governments, including France, Italy and Denmark, of willful neglect of a crisis that has been known about for many months. Over the past month, the number of deaths has grown sharply, according to aid organizations, prompting an exodus from southern Somalia towards the capital Mogadishu, as well as across borders. Some 2,000 Somalis are crossing into Ethiopia a day, with a further 1,300 coming to Kenya daily as well. Kenya, another American-backed regime, refused to allow Somalis to enter a brand new and empty refugee camp.
The Horn of Africa over the past decade has seen many devastations. Now is the first time a famine has been declared in the region since 1992. In that year, hundreds of thousands of Somalis starved to death, prompting an international peacekeeping intervention. Now, the next rains are not expected until September or October, and even if they are good, subsequent harvests are expected to be weak, due to the fact so many people have been uprooted. UNICEF, along with the UN, has been warning since January of a pending crisis, and statements have been issued to little avail. 2011 has been a year filled with natural disasters and social upheaval in all of Africa, that have all been competing for news attention around the world. Since drought is a gradual disaster, it is often very difficult to get the type of coverage needed in the short attention span media, and a general response that is needed to raise the funds to prevent that disaster. To be fair enough to the United States, issues of access and conflict have made the situation even more complicated for the U.S. than anticipated, but either way, the UN has warned that without immediate action, the famine would spread to all of Somalia within 2 months. And on a final note to this story, the Times of London, owned by this week's media frenzy-focused Rupert Murdoch's News Corporation, because of their high-profile scandal, has an editorial cartoon in yesterday's paper that I would like to end the segment with. Despite their own lack of coverage of either issue, this cartoon hits the main point in the whole mess: the fact that the mainstream is more focused on the flashy story that sells, rather than on something of substance that actually informs and may even help. That is all for this week's episode, and we end with our World Revolution news slogan. It's the United Banking Cartel versus us, and not me versus you, for we are the many, and they are the few.
Have a good weekend, everyone.